For decades, Canada has held a monopoly when it came to producing elite goaltenders. The province of Quebec on its own produced some pretty notable goalies like Marty Brodeur, Patrick Waugh, Roberto Luongo, and Marc-Andre Fleury, just to name a few. But nowadays, Canada is staring down the barrel of a massive crisis, a shortage of goaltenders, and an increasingly losing battle to non-Canadian, predominantly European goalie development methods. More and more goaltenders, especially highly talented and skilled ones, are coming in droves from Europe, while Canadian goaltenders are continuously falling behind. Just take a glance at the demographics of qualifying NHL goaltenders. Only 3 seasons ago, 39% of qualifying goalies were Canadian, but by 2021-22, that number had dropped to 31%, representing a decline of 8%. In a league that was once largely dominated by Canadian netminders, an ever-growing number of teams are now rostering an increasing number of non-Canadians. And unless trends reverse, fewer Canadian goalies will be suiting up for NHL teams in the upcoming years. So why exactly is this happening in hockey's hotbed, in a nation that has and continues to produce an endless supply of star skaters ad nauseum from within its territories? Because the current system in place in Canada is largely stacked against goaltenders. Hockey is an expensive sport to play, especially so for goaltenders. Not included with registration fees is the heavy costs goalies can expect to spend on their equipment, and as such the total price of outfitting a goaltender can be very financially draining on those footing the bill. Even the cheapest avenues of acquiring goalie gear can run up a hefty tab, and that's just getting a goalie into a league with the proper tools they need. Extra goalie-focused coaching and training sessions are another expense most prospective goalies end up having to add to the bill. Sure, it's not the end of the world to not have those training sessions, but regular practices are largely set up to develop skaters, not goaltenders. And while skaters reap the biggest benefits of those practices, the goalies are left with the short end of the stick, receiving less development than their skater counterparts for the same price. So while additional goalie sessions aren't an official requirement, it's an unofficial official requirement. What results is a financial barrier that can turn away many goalie hopefuls who simply can't afford to play the position, and creates a bias towards those who can afford the substantial monetary demands of the position. For some, the decision is obvious. Why pay for your goalie to be treated like the last dog at the bowl? The effects of this problem with Canada's goalie pipeline have reared its head at the highest peaks of the NHL level. This last season was a major down year for Canadian goaltenders, as only 3 Canadians managed to crack the top 20 by goals saved above expected: Darcy Kemper, Tristan Jarry, and Mike Smith. That trio is nothing to scoff at. They're fine goaltenders, but just 3 years ago, 8 of the top 20 goalies by goals saved above expected were Canadian, and 2 seasons ago that number had only managed to drop to 7. So in that 3-year stretch of time, a regular year for Canadian goaltending would be a year in which they already made up less than half of the top 20 netminders in the league by goals saved above expected, and a really bad year like last year saw their slim numbers dwindle even further, cutting down to include just the top 10, and the trend continues. 3 seasons ago, 6 Canadian goalies finished in the top 10, then 6 dropped to just 2, and by last season, only 1 Canadian remained: Darcy Kemper. In general, Canadian goaltenders aren't keeping up with their non-Canadian peers, especially when their peers are getting better at playing the position. Starting from the 2019-20 season, the average non-Canadian goalie was 2.1 goals saved above expected better than their Canadian counterparts. Then that 2.1 became 2.4 a year later, until this past season where that number soared to 3.6. To put that into perspective, last season, the difference between the average non-Canadian goalie and the average Canadian goalie was roughly the difference between Semyon Varlamov and Jake Allen. NHL teams have noticed this decline in the general quality of Canadian goalies, and on the flip side, the increasing upside of Euro goalies. Come draft time, teams might want to try and find a young goalie to add to the organizational pipeline, and when Europe is churning out goalies like Andrei Vasilevsky, Igor Shesterkin, Yusei Saros, and Jacob Markstrom on a seemingly consistent basis, it's clear that Canada isn't even in the same solar system as the European continent when it comes to goalie development. And if a team's going to spend a draft pick on a goalie, especially a valuable one, they're likely going to look over the Atlantic Ocean for one. Just last season, only 35% of the goalies drafted were from Canada, and 55% of the goalies selected last played in a Euro league before being drafted. but even that is an improvement from 3 drafts ago when Canada only managed to produce 25% of goalies selected and 60% of drafted goalies last played in a Euro League. Canadian netminders as of late have also usually been the second, third goalie to come off the board, as there just hasn't been a clear-cut elite goalie prospect from Canada in the last couple of drafts for teams to salivate over, especially not on the levels that Spencer Knight was for the United States in 2019 or Yaroslav Askarov was for Russia in 2020. Sebastian Cossa in 2021 is probably the closest thing Canada has had to offer lately, but some, like Bob McKenzie, had Sweden's Jesper Wallstedt above Cossa in their draft rankings. Looking ahead, this inability to produce a significant number of goaltenders worth drafting, elite ones especially, is a potential glimpse into what can be an even bleaker future of Canadian goaltending. For years, prospective Canadian junior goalies through thick and thin had Carey Price to look up to. Above anything else, they could say they wanted to be like Carey. With the future of Carey Price's career up in the air, the once bright beacon that was the Montreal Canadiens goaltender has faded, potentially never to be seen again. There simply isn't another Canadian-produced goalie that currently comes close to what Carey Price was. So who do prospective Canadian junior goalies look up to now? Darcy Kuemper? Jake Allen? It's just not the same. It also doesn't help that most Canadian teams don't even have Canadians as their starters. Vancouver and Winnipeg employ Americans Thatcher Demko and Connor Hellebuck between the pipes. Calgary and Ottawa have Sweden's Jacob Markstrom and Anton Forsberg, and it currently looks like Russia's Ilya Samsonov is running away with the Leafs' starting job, pending results of his injury status. Edmonton is weird in that they signed Jack Campbell to be their starter, but Stuart Skinner has posted up much better numbers than Campbell so far, so on that one it's kind of a wait-and-see situation. That leaves Montreal as the only Canadian team with an undisputed Canadian starter, Jake Allen. So even if there was an elite Canadian goalie lighting up the league, he's not currently playing for a Canadian team. If anything, they're playing for a team south of Canada's border. For example, Darcy Kuemper put up a great season last year for the Colorado Avalanche. This season, Carter Hart is playing out of his mind for the Philadelphia Flyers. Is this really where the future of the game is going? One where up-and-coming Canadian goaltenders will grow up wanting to be like Connor Hellebuck or Jacob Markstrom, when goalies before them grew up wanting to be like Felix Potvin or Jose Theodore? As developing goaltenders really pass Canada by so much that other countries in the world can do a much better job than the nation that lives and breathes hockey, there's no reason that Canada can't produce star goaltenders with their resources available, and their history that shows they can produce some of the best goalies to ever step onto the ice. If anything, Canada should be a powerhouse at producing elite goaltenders, but neglect has quickly caught up to Canada while the rest of the world moved forward. So how do things change? Help ease the financial pains felt by goaltenders, so that more can play the position without having to sacrifice an arm and a leg. Put more attention into proper goaltender development without treating goalies like the runt of the litter. Do those things, and Canadian junior goalies will be in a much better position to succeed than they are currently. It will be a long process to get to that point, but it's one that will have to be done if hockey's hotbed is to keep its head above water. Otherwise, there may very well be a future with no star Canadian goaltenders left.